Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start the third panel. Those of you who have hung in through 3 panels deserve the best seats at dinner, which will be coming up shortly. I recognize that the audience has not had that much of a chance to participate, so I'm going to ask the panelists to kind of say what you want to say, and we'll go around with maybe several rounds if we can get short, pithy remarks on the topic at hand, and leave some time for you if you wanted to ask a question, provoke one of these fine panelists. Let me introduce them to you right now. To your far left and my right is Dr. Ramesh Sepehrrad, who's a dear friend and a co-author, I'm proud to say, a scholar practitioner at the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University, and she is focusing her research on Iranian affairs, political governance, human rights, gender equality, and U.S. policy. Next is Linda Chavez, founder and chairwoman of the Center for Equal Opportunity, former White House Public Relations Liaison. And then we have Ambassador Kenneth Blackwell, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva. And we are joined by Mr. Mohammad Alsulami, the head of AGCIS, which is a think tank focused on Iranian affairs in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And finally, Senator Bob Torricelli, the former senator from New Jersey and congressman before that, who is well known to all of you who are involved in this subject. So let's talk about the role of opposition to Iran. I'm struck by something that Strawn Stevenson said a minute ago in a different context. He talked about the different branches of communism around the world during the peak of the Soviet Union, how they all fought like cats in a bag and hated each other. I'm not going to go that far, but when I listen to people who are exiled from Iran at think tanks, some of them may be NCRI, some of them may be former parliamentarians who are now in academia in the West, some of them may be Green Movement. They may have all different flavors. They tend to be in separate channels. They say, well, no, I'm not with them. No, I'm not part of that. I'm part of my own line of resistance. And yet they all say the same thing. They're against the regime's aggression, human rights abuses, illegitimacy, corruption, and all the things you've been hearing about. So I want to, instead of simply talking to people who are friends of the NCRI and patting ourselves on the back for having good solidarity, let's challenge ourselves and say what stands between today, in June 30th, 2017, and a future where everyone who is against this regime finds some common ground. What will it take? What will it take to convince analysts in Washington and in Paris and in London that indeed this resistance is followed and has a breadth of resonates with the people of Iran? How can we prove that? And how can we demonstrate it? I think it's challenging. And I'd like to go from your left to your right to my left. I just got off the plane, so that's the hardest thing I did today. And get everyone to sort of give us some quick thoughts on how do you make the resistance universal and show that it's connected to the people of Iran. Ramesh, you're up.
Thanks, Link. And I was going to play that card that just got off the plane, but you just took it away from me. So I think it is a very, very important question to answer, to really understand the landscape, the political landscape in Iran, and where does the various diversity of views stand when it comes to issue of human rights, issue of women's rights, equality, and this aspiration for a democratic Iran. And I think you mentioned that there are lots of groups out there that do have a claim on, I'm not with this particular Iranian opposition group. I actually believe in this other group. So a few years ago, I led a study of different opposition groups to really understand where the core argument is. And when you begin to dismantle the various claims of opposition and various claims of democracy and democratic movement, it really comes down to several key questions. One is their point of view on the issue of supreme leadership, velayat faqih, which is quite frankly the role of Khamenei today in today's politics of Iran. The second question is the view of any opposition when it comes to women's leadership and equality. And the third question is really embracing the diversity of point of views, whether it's ethnic, religious, or political views within a democratic republic of Iran. And I think to that extent, no one really stands out the way the National Council of Resistance stands out, or the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran stands out, not just in rhetoric, more importantly in practice, more importantly in what they've done in the last several decades, both from the leadership and all the way down to the day-to-day engagement with the Iranian public. The other argument, the other side of the coin is, well, then how do we know the NCRI and the PMI is actually popular in Iran, and do they enjoy the popularity amongst the Iranian people? So when it comes to measuring popularity of any political views in Iran, it's not as easy as running a survey and really collecting point of views and publishing polls to say, all right, so we've got a popularity of one group versus the other group. Because obviously the Iranian regime has made the price very, very heavy for the Iranian people to really publicly express their support for the NCRI or the PMI, given the fact that thousands of their supporters and their family members have been executed and imprisoned by the regime. What's very important, and as a political scientist, is a key indicator on where the popularity lies, is on the key moments of various uprisings. The supporters of the Iranian resistance have been out there with their message. They've actually have guided the discourse and the public discussion when it comes to clarity on the slogans that are shouted in the streets of Iran to the slogans that are written on the walls in Tehran and the various cities. So when you really look at all of those messages, you could understand, and as a political scientist, anyone in the room who is interested to conduct that study, you could understand, no matter what the risk is, the supporters of this resistance are out in the streets, are active, and are engaged. The daily protests, the daily uprisings, and various events, whether it's in a public lecture by the government officials, you see students, young people, old people, women, standing up, asking the key questions that really tells you the message of that question comes from the aspiration of those who are, in fact, on the side of the NCRI and not any other opposition group. So hopefully that kind of gives a bit of a context in terms of what's happening inside of Iran, the Iranian people's point of view, as well as the various claims when it comes to the issue of democracy and future free Iran.
Thank you. Linda Chavez, I'm sure you've heard from people in Washington saying, well, you went to Paris with those people. What's your view on forging a consensus and breaking through in Washington about who the resistance is and how to judge the resistance?
Well, it's obviously very difficult. I mean, I take a look at what's happening in this particular movement at this particular time, and I think about my dealings in previous years with Cuban American groups who were in a very similar situation. You had a group of refugees, largely in the United States, representing different factions, spending as much time fighting with each other as they did trying to see regime change in Cuba. And I think that is one of the great temptations that can basically undermine the effectiveness of an opposition group, is that there is so much competition, factionalism, and infighting that goes for who's going to actually emerge as the leader, that sometimes groups and individuals forget what the ultimate goal is. And certainly I have seen that, and I've heard that from people who say, well, why are you so close to the National Council of Resistance of Iran? There are other groups that you could be working with. They represent the real democratic resistance. From my point of view, it's not up to the government of the United States to necessarily sanction one group or another, or say this group is the favorite. But unfortunately, what has happened with the PMOI and the NCRI over the years is stemming from the groups having been put on the terrorist list during the Clinton years, there was a kind of natural resistance to working with these groups. And obviously that was lifted in large part because of efforts made by many of the people in this room, and because of the United States justice system, which said that the State Department was going to have to come up with actual proof to show that they were terrorists in the State Department's definition. But nonetheless, I think that made it more difficult. And I think some of us hope that with the new administration, and particularly one not named Clinton, that there might be more of an opportunity to have entree and at least to allow the PMOI to work openly and in the United States, to be given an audience in the United States, to allow travel, et cetera. And right now, it's unclear whether that will happen or not. But it would be my hope that at some point in the future, that will be possible, because it certainly, from everything that I have seen, both as Ramesh has said, but as we've seen over the years, when you look at the resistance movement in Iran itself, it does seem to have strong following in terms of the NCRI. And so it would seem to me that we do need to work to try to ensure that the NCRI's voice is able to be heard in the halls of government within the United States and to be recognized as a legitimate resistance movement.
Thank you. Ambassador Blackwell, your thoughts?
I think we first have to start off with an understanding that constructive engagement, appeasement, strategic partnerships, or strategic patience, these things, these strategies, these policies have not worked with the regime in Iran. And so you can look at it from two standpoints. One is from the standpoint of what is in the U.S.'s strategic interests, and two, what is the humanitarian thing to do? It is always nice when those two things line up with one another, but if in fact you have to start with one, I would imagine that in the United States, it would start with what is in the strategic interests of the United States to do among forces of freedom and forces that would topple this regime in Iran. And I think from that standpoint, the proof is in the pudding. The resistance across the board has been very, very helpful in providing strategic information to us at strategically important times. They have done it covertly, but they've also done it in the full light of day in terms of protest and taking a stand. The one thing that we know, and it goes from either our experience as parents or guardians or just practitioners of common sense, if you reward bad behavior, all you're going to get is more bad behavior. And that's a pretty simple formulation that has been used in all of human history in understanding human behavior. And so we, in fact, have to take a look at those forces of freedom, those forces of democracy, those forces who would undermine a regime that is the leading exporter of the international terrorism, as well as repression and oppression at home, as a signal as to what we should be doing in all international fora to strengthen those forces. Let me say here that we could take one of two approaches, and let me use metaphors here. The United States could choose to be a mechanic or could choose to be a gardener. The mechanic, tinkers with everything under the sun, and it takes an enormous strain on resources, and it crowds out other strategically important issues when you are just fully engaged as a mechanic. Or we can choose to be a gardener, and that is to make sure that we're supporting and nurturing those forces of freedom and those forces that advance human rights both internationally and domestically in Iran. In that case, we in fact have to look for forces of good, whether they are linked together or not. That is probably a naive expectation. And I think our approach has to be, let 1,000 blossoms bloom. And I think with 1,000 blossoms blooming, for the right reasons in their own individual lanes, we in fact can topple a corrupt, repressive, and terroristic regime.
Thank you. Dr. Alsulami, you're familiar with all the different parts of the resistance. We heard in the last panel about the Baluch and about the Kurdish separatists and the Arab population in Iran, not to mention the rest of the Iranian people, the Persians. What's your impression about the potential for them to have a common view?
Well, I think it's very important first, if you allow me, since the title is internal issues and of course the opposition. I will try, if you allow me, to make a bridge between the first two sessions and this session. Internal issues and external issues, regional issues and domestic issues in Iran. Why is that? Because there is a strategy for Iranian regime that since the beginning, the regime built its policy and strategy on exporting the problems from inside to outside to escaping the internal and Iranian people needs. That is, to me, as an expert on Iranian issues, very clear. And they always try to, if there is no problem, they try to make a problem in order to escape Iranian people demands in domestic issues. Why is that? How they do that? They always focus on three internal issues, whether enmity of Islam, enemy against Islam, or enemy of Islam, enemy of Islamic Republic, or enemy of Islamic Revolution. These are main three important claims that Iranian try to push back against its own people inside. And again, this links it to outside world and to their strategy and their demands or the ambitions to focus or control the region. And that's what we heard during the last two sessions. So exporting, for example, revolution is a key important issue when we are talking about Iranian internal, when we are talking about Iranian, we mean Iranian regime, not Iranian people. This is important to make it very clear to the audience. So they try to interfere in internal affairs of regional countries, Arab countries especially, and we are on front line, of course, with this, we are in that part of the world. Why they do that? They are escaping inside issues, and to understand it, we have to look at the details inside Iran. Iran is a very rich country. Oil, gas, natural resources, you call it. But even after the Iranian nuclear deal, we see, according to, official statistics and official sources, at least 50% of retired people in Iran are under the line of poverty. 75% of teachers in Iran under this line. 90% of laborers are under the line. Totally, 40% of Iranian people, this is maybe 3 months ago, this is a statistic, 40% of Iranian people are under the line of poverty in such rich and huge country. And we are talking about unemployment, addictions, even among kids, up to 12 years old kids, both boys and girls. And another thing, when we are talking about domestic issues and human rights, and that's maybe the main issue for opposition, whether inside or outside Iran, you see, and people claim that Rouhani is a reformist and he's tried to make a better living in Iran. We see that when we are talking about executions, it's almost doubled of what we've seen during Ahmadinejad period.
Yes.
All the money that Iranian regime received after the nuclear deal was sent outside, not into Iranian people, inside. So that's why they are still escaping inside issues and try to support sectarianism. And that leads me to external issues. How do we link these two things? We have to understand, and people in the previous sessions, mentioned that before 1979, know what's called religious extremism or terrorism in the region. Never ever before 1979. But the other important thing is no sectarianism in the region before 1979. So before 1979, Shia and Sunni used to live side by side. In Bahrain, in Iraq, in Kuwait, in eastern part of Saudi Arabia, nobody asked if you are Shia or Sunni. All these things came later on after 1979. And we've seen it in the Hajj as well, when they are trying to make, from the beginning, making these demonstrations in the Hajj, and with those slogans, death to America, death to, even to Saudi rulers inside Saudi Arabia. So if we look at the relation as well, I think it's very important and linked to this issue when we are talking about the relation between Iran and the regional countries. Saudi Arabia, Gulf states, Turkey, Yemen, Egypt. Before the revolution, the relation was excellent. Although there was some disagreements, political disagreements, but they still used to solve it or resolve it in a political way, not through proxy wars. If you don't, I don't know if you know this reality or not. In 1955, the Saudi king spent his holiday in Iran. That is reality. That is King Saud in 1955. He visited Iran and then so there is no issue between Iran and the Gulf states. There is no sectarianism, terrorism. But afterward, you see from the beginning, the focus in exporting revolution, and that maybe leads me to the point that we need to support Iranian people, because we have no problem with Iranian people. Iranian people really doing their best to coexist with neighboring countries. They try to solve the problems, to reach out to the neighboring countries and the neighboring people. And myself, I sent many messages in Persian to Iranian people, and well received inside Iran and outside Iran among Iranians. So we have to isolate this political system in Iran. As Iranian people inside have problems with this regime, we do in the region have problem with this regime as well. So we need to coexist, to have a better life, to have a peaceful neighboring situation in the region, and that's, I think, for us, in the region, for Iranian people, for the world, it's better. And I hope and pray for that the day comes when we have a better relation with Iran without maybe this regime.
Thank you. Well, you've described a situation that's become more and more fractured and more divided. So I want to ask Senator Torricelli, that's sort of where we began, is that there's, as Linda described, there are people in their own, are sort of fighting each other half the time and fighting the main enemy the rest of the time. What's your perspective on what's needed to coalesce, focus, and unite the opposition?
Well, first, there's no better place for a politician to be than be the last speaker on the last panel, because I can say the most outrageous thing and no one's going to be able to contradict me. So thank you for the order of speaking.
You're welcome.
Being the last panel and having heard all the others kind of begs the question, what are we all doing here? And my guess is that the number of reasons to be here is almost exactly equal to the number of people in the room. Many of you have suffered extraordinary tragedies and the murder of members of your family. Most have seen the enslavement of your country. Many of you have seen generations lose economic, political, and personal hope. And some of you have natural allies from around the world. I will confess that I joined this movement because through most of my life I've seen the world through a simple prism, that which was good for the United States and that which was not. Over time, my affection for this cause has become more complex as you learn of the suffering, the tragedies, the complexities, the people, the culture, and many of you may have traveled the same road. But nevertheless, there are a lot of rooms around the world where people are gathering to discuss Iran. Why be in this one? There are many roads where the world deals with its political problems. Every historic circumstance has its own resolution. And the tragedy in Iran could be solved as a result of international conflict, like the end of fascism in Europe. But I doubt it. An Iranian-American, Iranian-European military confrontation because of the nuclear accords being violated is possible, but I doubt it. There could be another regional military confrontation that results in the fall of Tehran, but given Iranian military power, probably not. The regime could heal itself and evolve, but there's no evidence of that. The most likely course of events is that at a point more analogous to communism, it's simply going to implode from within because it is an unsustainable political, human, economic situation. And so the question continues to be asked, why in this room? Ramesh, actually, when I talked earlier about studies she had done, if I can steal your material, that all of us have to ask. I'm for the MEK, but not just because I like the people in the MEK. They serve a function for my country, for causes I believe in, for the aspirations of the Iranian people. What opposition rejects the notion of the supremacy of the Ayatollahs? Who would genuinely restore a republic? Who generally would have Iran again join the family of nations with the respect of international norms of human rights? Well, there are many people who would claim to form a loyal opposition, but we don't need a loyal opposition. Isn't that what Rouhani was? There is going to be no internal reform. At a certain point, reality has to overcome hope. We all hoped for that what happened in '79 was just a passing nightmare. In time, a great people and a great culture will overcome this. Well, it doesn't always happen, and it's not going to happen here. The MEK remains the only viable organization set on complete political change with the will and the resources that's willing to make the sacrifice. What's the sacrifice? Take a Saturday noon off to protest? Write a letter to the editor? No, sacrifice is life and death, fighting a despotic regime, and doing it every day, every year, for the rest of your life until it changes. That's the MEK. Got any other candidates? Because I don't know any. In any case, that's why we're here. Because we have refused to give up on the notion that Iran can take its rightful place in the world and that the Iranian people and their children can again claim the future. And these discussions every year, while they may be long and sometimes painful, are how movements decide on strategies, grow, and flourish. I know to each of you who watch this every day, this year may seem like last year and the year before and 10 years before. That's because you don't have perspective. Watch it from a distance. It is growing. It's growing. When I became involved in the MEK, it was on the terrorist list of the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. When I joined the MEK, Mrs. Rajavi was not welcomed in foreign capitals. When I joined helping the MEK, there were refugees encircled, being murdered at a camp in Ashraf. One by one, the obstacles have come down. Acceptance has grown from being banned to being heralded in Western capitals, from being on a terrorist list to being at the core of decision-making in the United States. It may seem glacial, but power is growing, forces are marshaling. This is going to happen. In any case, it's the only strategy with the only alliance that holds real hope. That's why we're here.
Thank you. So let me try to do a second round and ask a question that I think
I thought I had the last word.
Is probably equally challenging. And that is, in Washington today, in Riyadh today, there are policy analysts who are saying, what will be the trigger for the regime to lose control? We've heard vignettes at the end of 2009. They almost lost control of the streets of Tehran as they were rounding up dissidents from the election of Ahmadinejad. Is it because they're taking all the resources, as Dr. Alsulami said, and spending it outside the country and trying to sell pride instead of economic hope and opportunity to the people? I mean, there are people in this room who are prolific writers about these issues who have a thesis of what will it be? Is it economics? Is it legitimacy? Which piece of legitimacy? And from that insight, the governments of the neighboring countries in the United States and Europe could actually begin to take more focused action. And it sounds to me like information and psychology are the ultimate nexus of facts and the fall of the regime. That at some point people say, I'm going into the street, I'm joining the protest, I'm going to stand my ground and hold the sign and say no more. But why? What's the trigger? Ramesh?
So I think if you would indulge me to shift the conversation a little bit and look at what's happening in Iran since Khatami's re-election in the last 40 days, because I think the triggers are actually sparking all over the Iranian societies as we see. Khatami, during the campaign, towards, I guess, a few days right before the election, used the discussion around ongoing executions, and in fact, he used specific reference to the 1988 massacre of the political prisoners as a way to legitimize his campaign against Khamenei, at that point who was rooting for Raisi as his preferred candidate for presidential elections. So that particular move on Rouhani's part may have worked for him tactically, but strategically, it has weakened the regime in its entirety since the elections. It put Khamenei in a corner to come back and respond to that in such a strong way. And this dialogue continues to happen. The undertone of that particular claim of the 1988 is the actual movement inside of Iran, the families who have lost their loved ones in the 1988 massacre, who have been working on this movement of justice for the loved ones who were killed in the summer of 88, 30,000 people because of Khomeini's fatwa. And that movement is becoming very, very widespread in Iran, and in fact has resonated across the Western capital. So I think that itself could be a very, very strong anchor if the policymakers in the West are serious to really support the call of the Iranian people for democracy, for human rights, and for justice, is to really join that conversation and hold the Iranian government and hold the Iranian regime to its criminal act and continue to sanction regime, not just economically, but from a political, from a human rights, call the Iranian regime out. So I think there's that aspect that's going on within the Iranian dynamics and the politics. But the dialogue and the confrontation between Khamenei and Rouhani has escalated as we've never seen before. In fact, one thing, I think the new word that we should start using when it comes to understanding the various political factions in Iran is not factions, it's not political factions, because we tend to kind of use the factions in more of a healthy debate between various point of views. But it's a very, very deadly schism that's happening amongst the Iranian leadership on one side and the Iranian people on the other side. And this shift, this rift that's going on between Rouhani and Khamenei, where they're constantly at each other's throat. You know, in Iranian analogy and in some of our Farsi discussions, we have this analogy that we use, that if you kind of consider the Iranian regime as this piece of cloth, with the death of Khomeini, that cloth had a tear in it. And the factions kept pulling it apart and stitching it back together over the years. Well, guess what? The tear has gotten to a point and it's beyond repair at this point. And Khamenei and Rouhani both are on the losing side of this. And the Iranian people are actually taking advantage of this. What's interesting in this whole new equation is, on the surface, it seems like they're going at each other from a factional infighting, where Khamenei is trying to consolidate the hardliners, so-called hardliners and conservatives, against the Rouhani's moderates and reformers. But ultimately, what it's coming down to is that they both are weakening the regime, and they both are strengthening the hands of the Iranian people and the Iranian opposition. And that is what the West should look into and continue to promote as a discussion and really a new political discourse when it comes to the seriousness that's needed for Iran policy. And I'm speaking mostly from a US standpoint because my familiarity is with Washington's point of view on Iran. But quite frankly, this is the opportunity for Washington to get serious about Iran.
Let me just ask a quick follow-up
Sure.
of you, Ramesh, because you follow the regime's internal debates. Would failure, as opposed to success, in their campaign in Syria, propping up Bashar al-Assad, if the UN transition actually went through with some muscle from other factions, the US and others, if the Yemen war were resolved diplomatically, quickly, and the Houthis didn't really come out of it very well, and the IRGC had to take their missiles home, one or two, three things, does that make a difference back in Tehran, or is it really happening of its own accord?
I think it's the two-pronged approach that Dr. Alsulami was talking about, that the export of crisis outside of Iran while maintaining the suppression at home has been, quite frankly, key to Iran's success over the last more than 3 decades. So, I think if that particular structure starts to crumble, you will see the crumbling and the imploding inside of Iran. In fact, one of Iran's own highest level of IRGC has warned in recent days about the cancer that's growing inside of Iran that would implode. And I'm using the quote cancer because that's the word he used. That would implode the regime in Iran. So I think if the two-pronged approach loses its alignment, then you're absolutely right.
It's the same word that Prince Turki Al-Faisal used on the stage at the rally last year, the Khomeinist cancer.
Yes.
So, Linda, your views on steps that could precipitate a change?
Well, I mean, at a certain point, a critical mass develops that finally says enough. We're not going to put up with it anymore. And it seemed that that point was almost reached in 2009. Unfortunately, I think the United States' unwillingness to be more supportive of the Green Revolution was very demoralizing. And we're now seeing more and more demonstrations against the regime in Iran. We saw the pictures of Madame Rajavi hung from the overpasses. During the election, the pamphlets, posters put on the walls, basically, saying no to the elections, no to Raisi, no to Rouhani. And so we can see that kind of bubbling up again. And I think that Ramesh is right, that if you start to see collapse of these foreign engagements, I mean, I think obviously the Iranian people don't want their sons to go to fight the war in Syria to save Bashar al-Assad. And I mean, today there was an article in, I think it was the New York Times, an op-ed about the way in which refugees are being given permanent resident status if they are willing to go and fight in Syria, so that Iranian boys don't have to go. You've got now people from Afghanistan, young Afghanis who are going to fight these wars. So if we see a collapse, if we see resolution in places like Yemen and Syria, I think that that could help this bubbling up process. But no matter what and how effective groups on the outside can be, ultimately it has to come from within. And I mean, the one way in which I think the NCRI is very effective is that there are people in Iran who look to the NCRI. So being able to give the support to those who are actually going to go out on the streets in Tehran and elsewhere. But that's where it's got to come from, and it's going to come from, you know, who knows what the proximate cause is going to be. I mean, often these things happen as they, you know, did in Libya over what is almost seems like a trivial matter, just one person's life affected, and the revolution starts. And hopefully we will see that, and hopefully we will see that soon.
A quick data point, 3 days ago, the State Department issued the Trafficking in Persons annual report. Most of the Middle East countries were in Tier 2, which means they have work to do, but they're not in the worst tier. Iran was alone among Middle East countries in Tier 3, and cited specifically were the young Afghan males who were being conscripted into slavery, essentially, to go fight in Syria.
Right.
So this came out of Secretary Tillerson's State Department. Ambassador Blackwell, what do you, from your experience, what are the triggers that, I mean, if you're a policy planner in Washington, how can you listen to this and say, okay, this is what we can do that's useful?
Well, again, I'll stay consistent with my opening theme. First is the regime's illegitimacy is multifaceted. So that is an advantage that we have if we can give coalition to those who suffer as a consequence of its illegitimacy, both domestically and internationally. They are a leading exporter of not only terrorism, but of hate and fanaticism. And we have to shine the light. There's a saying in the Bible. Those who would do evil love the darkness. And we have an obligation as NGOs, as other governments, as individual advocates for human rights, to shine a light in the dark corners of the illegitimacy of the regime. And so I think that from our national standpoint, they are an existential threat, not only to the neighborhood in which they are placed, but because of their exporting of terrorism, they are a direct threat to international stability, peace, harmony, and economic and cultural advancement. And so we have to connect the dots by shining a light wherever that darkness reigns. And I think it starts from a superpower standpoint in speaking truth to other major and great powers. There's no way that we can avoid speaking truth to Russia. We have to speak truth to Russia about their coalescing and their support of a regime that is exporting so much terror. They might not get to a point where they call for regime change, but they can get out of the way for those of us who are. We, in fact, have to realize that this is a long-distance effort. It is not a sprint. You know, human rights struggles are, by definition, not a spectator sport. You cannot sit on the sidelines and think that meaningful change is going to happen. You have to engage with what you have, how you can, where you are. And in sending out that sort of clarion call, I think that we will get a coalescing of efforts that will trigger major changes, inside, outside, outside, inside. But believe me, their illegitimacy is so multifaceted, having so much destruction in people inside and outside of Iran, that I think that their reign has a short life expectancy. But we all must remember that even today, it took those brave fighters for freedom in Tiananmen Square that in fact took a stand against a government that was crushing human rights, that gave spark to the fires of change. And even now, there's still that struggle within China. So this is not a sprint. And Robert was right. He's been engaged, and a number of us have been engaged in this for a long time. We've seen incremental change for the bets, but we must remember this is not a sprint, and we must put a light not only on the evil, but a light as he did on the accomplishments, because that feeds greater energy and greater effort to bring about regime change.
Thank you. Dr. Alsulami, let me ask you, pick up on Ambassador Blackwell's point about shining light on different facets of illegitimacy, one that some of us are less qualified to talk about, which is Islam. If I'm right, and you can challenge my premise, the NCRI and the MEK before them were the #1 threat to the regime for a simple reason, that they didn't accept Khomeini's interpretation of Shia Islam, the Twelver interpretation, that he was the embodiment of the Imam, in the 12th Imam. And that because the MEK stood for a more modern interpretation, gender equality, human rights, separation of church and state, that this was the single most threatening opposition. Anyone else who had issues they could deal with, communists, economic opponents, but this pointed right at the legitimacy of the entire franchise. If that's right, what can be done to shine a light on the illegitimacy of the way that Khamenei has carried forward the role of Velayat Faqih? What can be done to say this is corrupt, this is immoral, this is not religion? Mm-hmm. He is a power-hungry dictator, not a religious figure, a divine figure. Can you speak to that issue?
Thanks. You are totally right in this. And I think the solution comes from inside Iran and from outside Iran. When we are talking about Shiism, Iran, or the Iranian regime, claims they are the leader of Shiism in the world. Iran is the leader of Shiism in the world. And they built that on their own ideology that was created after 1979, which is Wilayat Mutlaq Faqih, which is the superior leadership, the total or ultimate superior leadership, Wilayat Mutlaq Faqih. And that is something new in Shiism and never been really challenged inside and outside Iran for different reasons. So if you want to bring this down, you have to work inside and outside. The religious leaders and clerics inside Iran have the duty to challenge that. There's something new in Shiism. This is one. Second, outside, the Shiism, or Shia outside Iran. For example, in Iraq, Bahrain, Lebanon, they have to differentiate between Shiism and the Khomeini Shiism, the pure Shiism and Khomeini Shiism. There is huge difference. The Khomeini Shiism is a political Shiism and religious Shiism. They use the religion for political reason. They killed Shia inside Iran, and they helped Armenia against Azerbaijan, which is a Shia state. 90% of Azerbaijani people are Shia, not Sunnis. And they attacked the Shia in Azerbaijan for what? Because they are different political agenda. They are against kind of nationalistic joined with religious ideology. This is, I think, very important. And we have to differentiate between Qom and Najaf and Karbala. Qom became now a very important place for Shia. This is after 1979 mostly. The homeland, if we call it the homeland of Shiism, is not in Qom, in Najaf and Karbala. And Iran weakened the all important clerics and Shia Ayatollahs outside Iran who do not follow Iranian ideology or interpretation of Shia Islam. So this is very important, and I think it's a very key, and that nobody can do it. Nobody can do that except Shia themselves, whether inside Iran or outside Iran. If I have 2 or 3 minutes to talk about what you mentioned about how can we put more pressure on Iranian regime, I have maybe 4 or 5, up to 6 points very quickly. Very quickly. First, I think there is a common ground between all the different oppositions, whether inside or outside. They have to work together and work on these common elements against the Iranian regime. Second, IRGC, and some people mentioned in the previous session, has to be put on the list of terrorist organizations. Third, cutting Iranian arms outside Iran. Hezbollah, Houthis, terrorist organization in Bahrain, in Iraq, and different. We have to push back against the Iranian regime in this element. Fourth, I think it's pressure from international community. Iran has committed many crimes.
Yes.
Attacked diplomatic missions, whether inside Iran or outside Iran. American embassy in Kuwait and Lebanon, Saudi embassy twice, British embassy, Canadian embassy, you call it. And nobody does anything against that. They also attacked diplomats outside and inside Iran. One of them was a Saudi who was killed in Iran in 1987, and many others, in Karachi and different parts of the world. They committed many terrorist operations outside Iran, in Argentina, in Saudi Arabia, in Africa, Nigeria, and different parts. Nobody challenged that. They have to be brought to the court, and they have to put all the international community has to put pressure on Iranian regime on that. This is a very important, I think, issue when we are talking about Iranian regime. And very last point, people think there is conservatives and reformists in Iran when we are talking about Iranian regime, and you mentioned that. When we are talking about the current system, no difference between Khatami or Rouhani from one side and Ahmadinejad, Khamenei, or whoever comes later on. No difference. They are from one small circle, doesn't represent Iranian people. For example, when the people went to the street in 2009, they say, where is my vote? They were not asking for really vote. They were against Iranian regime, the whole Wilayat Faqih. But that was an excuse to go into the street and to demonstrate. So many of my friends in the United States, ask them, why you think Rouhani is better than Ahmadinejad, and you are celebrating and...
I don't understand that. I think people should turn off their phones. Mine is off.
So why you support Rouhani and think he's better? They say he's the reformist and he can change the regime from within. And now it's proven that it's strong. No difference between Ahmadinejad and it's in the other side, the opposition. opposite. They are Rouhani is more dangerous than Ahmadinejad. Ahmadinejad was outspoken person. He used to say what really represents the Iranian regime and not with good smiling faces, and it does different things.
Thank you very much. So, Senator Torricelli, you've heard all these ideas. What's your thought on how we can, in the near term, being very patient strategically, but in the near term, what can we intelligently do to increase pressure against the regime?
I actually like your former question better.
Okay. I retract the question.
What precipitates the change? What's the event? Ambassador Blackwell and Linda both approached the issue. The simple answer to that is I have no idea. And the fact is, growing up as a kid in suburban New York, I would have thought the precipitating events for change in Iran would have happened 100,000 deaths ago, a generation of economic suffering ago, a long, long time ago. But you learn a lot of lessons in life, some good, some bad. The most disappointing and surprising of my life in government has been the capacity of people to accept their lot in life and their suffering. It's staggering what people will endure until they say no more. And that's part of the lesson of Iran. So at this point in my life, I take away two lessons. First, people demanding freedom and economic opportunity, it is inevitable. There's no question about that. But it is far more delayed with a willingness to accept brutality than I ever would have believed as a child. Take those two truths. So Linda alluded to a number of the historic examples. And the thing I love about history is, as impossible as it is to decipher when you're living through it, and it is impossible. I mean, looking back 10 years hence, how inevitable it looks. It's extraordinary. And one of the great indictments we used to do when I was in the Intelligence Committee of the House, if you took kind of the 5 greatest events in world history, from World War II through contemporary time, the $40 billion American intelligence establishment missed all of them. That's how hard it is to judge history. What's the precipitating event? Linda alluded to some. I recently read The Last Days of the Cold War. Who knew? But as you look back, the lack of competitiveness in East Germany and Poland, the decline of foreign exchange, the declining life, of course it happened. Of course, except no one saw it coming. As Linda said, a single shopkeeper in Tunisia gets asked for a bribe. How many bribes were there in Tunisia for shopkeepers? One too many. One too many. How many people were murdered by Egyptian security forces until that day in the square? One too many. That's history. History is replete with the examples. You don't need me to give them. I have no idea in Iran, but I know that there's just one too many political murders, one too many executions in jail, one too many kids who have no economic future, no hope, and their parents are despondent. Don't know when. Don't know what the number is. That's not my job. That's not your job. That's history. Our job is to ensure on the day it reaches that level, there is a structure ready to rise. That's Mrs. Rajavi's responsibility. It's the MEK's responsibility. It's all of our responsibilities as supporters. I'll get the most American analogy I can. Incredibly, it's a lot like surfing. We don't make the wave. We just train to understand the moment to ride it. That's all of our jobs. And that's coming. Wish I were wise enough to tell you when, but I don't know anybody who can. But it's coming.
Well, whether you realize it or not, you may just have given Bruno Tertre his T-shirt. I don't know how to say one too many in Farsi, but I think that's the thought, is that that's what's coming, is one too, it might be a blank face behind jail bars, but it's one too many. So well done. So everyone has their assignments. You're going to work on the religious subversion of the Faqih, and Ken is going to make sure that we're all involved minute by minute, even though we don't know when or how, etc. So now I'm going to give the audience a microphone. I'm going to ask you to challenge this panel, because I'm out of questions. Do we have a microphone? Somebody have a microphone to hand out or not? Yes?
While the microphone is going around, let me just say that that the new administration in Washington has some seasoned veterans that I think hold a lot of promise, from General McMaster's National Security Advisor to General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, to former Senator Dan Coates, who is now the Director of National Intelligence. This is not their first rodeo. I think they understand the dynamics that are at play, and I think they will be crafting policy options that will help the president map a coherent policy going forward.
Great. Let me hand the microphone to Professor Tanter.
Yes, Raymond Tanter.
Could you use the mic? We are filming, so.
No sound.
There's no sound?
I don't.
Yeah,
Oh,
no.
sorry.
They're pretty good at this.
He's a professor.
Raymond Tanter of the American Committee on Human Rights. Between this panel and the last panel, I had a brief discussion with the ambassador. And the issue can be placed in three prongs as far as I'm concerned. First of all, the NCRI is a coalition of coalitions. And the issue is how you expand that base as far as I'm concerned. And to the NCRI's credit, it has done an outstanding job with these three panels in having non-Iranian Americans, non-Iranians dominate these panels in terms of the numbers. I'm impressed by that. That's a good step. The second point is that there has to be a concrete set of actions to reach out to the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, to the Greeks, to the other ethnic groups who share, forget the Greeks for the moment, who share antipathy toward the Iranian regime. I don't see that happening. I go to every American Israel Public Affairs Committee event in Washington. I've spoken to the National Jewish Fund. I consider myself a student of the AIPAC as I am a student of the Iranian resistance. And the third point is that when I was in Ashraf in 2008, I had a chance to meet with the different ethnic groups, the Turkomans, the Arabs, the on and on and on. And I was very impressed. I knew that there was a coalition of coalitions, but the Persians still dominated the NCRI. And when Senator Torricelli talks about this, he talks about the MEK. He mentioned the NCRI once, I think. But the MEK, the PMOI, is only one part of the coalition. That coalition itself has to be expanded internally, and then people who are disaffected from the National Iranian American Council, don't say the word, some people are disaffected. And these people should be brought over, and there should be a constant. Who's going to do this? The NCRI US is overworked, understaffed. There is no time to do it. I am not an advocate of the NCRI. I told that to one person. He said, well, the regime thinks you are. But the point I'm making is that there has to be some resource allocation in terms of time and people to expanding the base, so there's a centrifugal force that can help bring down the Iranian regime. This is what my studies have indicated. I yield the floor.
Okay, thanks, Professor. Could someone take the microphone to the gentleman against the wall?
That's working.
Think we go. Thanks. And we'll invite comments in a minute, and you'll be third. We'll see how much time we have. We have a few minutes.
Yes, someone from Yemen also.
Please don't.
Thank you very much. I just want to be brief. I want to bring a witness to
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Pervez Sulgi-Kazai. I was a career diplomat in Iran under the Shah, and then a young man who was also very active in democracy movement, but we got the worst out of it. We have been jumping from the frying pan into the fire. So that's why my post was acting ambassador in Sweden and Norway after the revolution, but soon I got disillusioned and I joined underground the Iranian National Council of Resistance with Mr. Rajavi came and declared it in Paris. And I asked and was working as a mole in the embassy for 2 years until they have found out about my activities. So I was just looking around whom I should join, because resistance movement is not to open a shop or to open an attractive business and people, they get some immediate interest and incentives of it. I just saw that this National Council of Resistance founded by Mr. Rajavi was the answer. Why? I come quickly to why. Because here also, again, in the history, time and time again, there is an ideology who is aggressive, which is very destructive and human, and using a religion. Look at the Middle Age, the Middle Age churches, who become the symbol. That was Martin Luther, and later Calvin, and also the other progressive Catholics and others. And who became the symbol of the democracy and movement in the United States? It was Thomas Jefferson and others, and Mahatma Gandhi. I think today, as the gentleman from Saudi Arabia said it, this is a very serious question, because there is an ideology which is seeing the world black and white. And then before that, I was a young diplomat in Iran. We have never had any problem with Saudi Arabia. We have never had any problem with the Arabs. We have never had any problem. There were intermarriages between the communities, Shia, Sunnis, Arabs and Baha'is, and all, they were marrying each other. So this ideology, apart from the coalition, which is very good, let it be political coalition, or sometimes it is necessary to just evict the regime from the region by military, why not? Like Hitler, we have done. Let this ideology be fought by an ideology which is progressive. This is the only remedy. This is the only remedy. Today, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi is a symbol for me of a person who is a woman, is a Muslim, but they interpret Islam differently, entirely differently. It is an impediment. It is just like an anti-poison to it. This is the thing. This is the one that I think we have to have a symbol, because before we had Mahatma Gandhi as a symbol, and we had many of them. Let us unite. I say it as a diplomat, I am a professional man, and I work for them in the Nordic, Baltic countries as a representative. But let's really give the chance to the progressive Islam, and let's unite all the good Muslims against this horrible, despicable, destructive ideology. This is my advice to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. If I may look in the audience and see if there are any women who have a comment, because one of the things we haven't explicitly talked about is the role of gender equality, the focus on women's rights as the marker of human rights in the Middle East, and how Madame Rajavi represents that, and how the women of the NCRI are so valuable as co-leaders of the movement. And of course, this panel, I think, beats the other two in terms of gender representation. So I'll yield the microphone to the lady in the third row.
Thank you very much. I am Maria Elena Alberdin. I'm the president of the International Federation of Women in Legal Career. As a lawyer, I want to denounce the corruption of the system of Iran in the case of Argentina. I'm an Argentinian citizen, and it was really a case of corruption of the justice, and in collaboration with the Kirchner government. And also with Venezuela. That's, everybody in our region knows the big business they make with the uranium and, and the collaboration with the dictatorial system of Chavismos. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you think, would you mind, I'd love if we could just get 30 seconds
Yes.
of what she thinks happened in Argentina.
Absolutely. If you could give us your view, because everyone knows the story, but there were court papers in the Second Circuit of New York after 9/11 that had the Argentinian government's report that named Khamenei, Rafsanjani, who were in the room when the decision was made to run the operation. Since that time, you had a president who under enormous pressure from Tehran, said, we have no idea what happened, we need to investigate.
And then the assassination also. Let's not forget the assassinations that also took place.
Exactly, that's right.
Yes.
What do you think?
Well,
What do you think the facts are?
Well, my English is terrible. I want to apologize about that, but as a witness from Argentina of the situation, it was the terrorists killed many people in the embassy in Argentina, and everybody knows that's what happened. And after many years of corruption in the justice of Argentina, and they arrived at the conclusion that it was the Hamas group that was making this. Then Cristina Kirchner decided to send all the actions to the government of Iran. Then that's decline the sovereignty to make the judgment of the terrorist. And then, but then what happened in Iran with the terrorists. They say nothing, they finish the situation of this many people killed, the terrorism act that was become a place of terrorists as France, Belgium, or some another place. And in Venezuela, and I know, I lived for 20 years there in Venezuela, and I know that it was the relationship was very, very close with the regime with Chavez, and they send money, so much money through the Venezuelan government to Argentinian. And it was, a big business region. That's all. I cannot make it a real denounce, but I know what the people said.
Very interesting. We have 1 minute left, so we're going to give this gentleman here who had a two-finger request, or at least one of his fingers was up. I don't want to get in trouble here.
More for the people who are interested from Yemen, the area you are talking about.
I'm sorry?
He's talking about.
No, there's no space for the people from Yemen to talk about the tourism in both in tourism.
Well, let's all right. We'll ask the gentleman, please, to make his brief remark, and if we have a moment, I'd like to hear your summary. Sir, please.
I'm Khalaf Ali Al-Khalaf, Syrian writer and international relations researcher. I have a comment about what Stevenson in the previous session said, and Mohammad Alsulami. I agree with them both that Islamic terrorist or Islamic extremist has launched with Khomeini. But this doesn't make change in this situation. I think there's some difference between Shiism and Sunnism. Shiism is institution, and Khomeini, when he came to Iran, make transformation of Shiism from a level of or element of identity, Iranian identity, to be the primer, to be the identity for whole Iranian. So I think Alexander Wendet, who researcher in international relations, said identity are the basis of interest. So I think we can't avoid Shiism as a major level of identity layer of Iranian. We need to look for Shiism as institution. It is Iranian expedition in the region, in the Middle East, has this toll. This is the prime toll to after USA invasion to Iraq. They use Shiism as a toll to this expedition in the Middle East, in Iran, in Syria. But when we say before Khomeini or before Iranian revolution or Islamic revolution in Iran, there is no tensions between Shi'i and Sunni, that's right. But now we have this situation. Shi'ism now is intervention as ideology for intervention in the region. So this is, I think, the question, what we can do for this as a researcher, as a writer, or as a politician also. Shiism now, the prime toll for Iranian. So what we can do for that?
It's a very big question, so something we must think about. I want to give 1 minute, please, to the gentleman from Yemen, and then we're late for dinner. So, but it's a part of the problem that we haven't spoken about. Please, sir.
Okay, in fact there is one article, very clear article in the Iranian constitution, which means exporting the revolution, and they already did that. They already started to do that, especially in Yemen. Now in Yemen, Houthis who represent Iranian regime, who is the tool of Iranian regime in our area, in my country, began to change the educational system. This educational system now are going to create new terrorists, which means new terrorists against the United States, new terrorists against the area around Yemen, neighbors, and also in the whole world. We have to get back to the, in fact, about Al-Mosul story. Maybe you know about it as a military, commander, who send a lot of vehicles and money to Al-Mosul, who feed ISIS in Iraq. So in fact, to give that a bad reputation against Sunni, they helped to create Daesh. So I think the Iranian regime is the only terrorist regime in the world who supports terrorist group. So I mean, how to deal with that? It is time now for deeds, not words. So I mean, we are talking about how to do with that, how to deal with that. We need to do where or when or blah, blah. No. Now we need to more actions against this regime, because this regime is going to create more terrorist group in the whole world. How to deal with the Iranian regime? I'm here because I'm a journalist, in fact, and also I have a human rights organization, so we are focused on violations. Now we have violations against people, nations. So if this regime still continue to export their revolution, their extremism revolution, their terrorist revolution to the world, I think you are going, United States and the Arab world and the whole world going to suffer from this regime. So I ask to be more careful and to take more actions. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. And my political friends in Yemen point out that there really is urgency to have a diplomatic end to this soon, because if the war continues, it will become, we won't be able to turn the clock back. So although we have a long strategic horizon, there are things that require urgent action. I'm going to say thank you all for hanging in there for 3 panels. I want to thank Ramesh Sepehrrad, Linda Chavez, Ken Blackwell, Mohammad Alsulami, and Robert Torricelli. Thank you all, and we'll see you.
Thank you, everybody.